It's a strange thing about worry. It often appears when nothing is actually wrong. The room is quiet, the day is ordinary, and yet the mind begins whispering little stories about what might go wrong tomorrow. A conversation that hasn't happened yet, a mistake that hasn't occurred, a disappointment that may never arrive. And before we realize it, our peaceful moment has quietly filled with invisible weight. Many people believe this constant worrying is a form of protection. After all, if we anticipate problems, we might be better prepared for them, right? But here's the surprising truth that few people talk about. Sometimes the very habit meant to protect us becomes the thing that quietly steals our sense of freedom. Because worry has a subtle trick. It convinces us that every thought deserves our attention, every fear deserves investigation, every possibility deserves preparation. And so the mind begins building long chains of imagined futures, link after link, until the present moment feels strangely heavy. But what if those chains aren't as strong as they seem? What if the thoughts that keep us restless are more fragile than we've been taught to believe? In this story, you'll meet someone who spent years preparing for storms that rarely arrived. Someone who believed that worry was necessary until a quiet encounter revealed something unexpected about the mind. Something so simple that most people overlook it. And once he saw it clearly, the chains that once felt unbreakable began to loosen. Not through force, not through control, but through a small shift in awareness that anyone can practice, even in the middle of an ordinary day. And if you stay with this story for a few minutes, you may begin to notice something surprising as well. Something that could quietly change the way you relate to every worried thought that appears. Morning often arrived quietly in Daniel's small apartment, yet his mind was rarely quiet with it. Even before his feet touched the floor, a low hum of worry had already begun its work, whispering gentle warnings about things that might go wrong later that day. The strange part was that nothing had happened yet. The sunlight came softly through the curtains, the kettle warmed the kitchen with a mild hiss, and still his chest carried a subtle tension, as if trouble were already waiting just outside the door. He had grown used to this inner companion. It followed him while brushing his teeth, while tying his shoes, even while enjoying the first sip of coffee that should have tasted peaceful. Instead, his thoughts wandered ahead into imagined conversations, possible mistakes, and awkward moments that hadn't happened. Oh, it was a quiet habit, but a persistent one, like a radio playing somewhere in another room that never quite switched off. Daniel often caught himself preparing for storms that weren't in the sky. If a colleague might criticize him later, he rehearsed explanations. If a message hadn't been answered, he pictured disappointment. Even during pleasant moments, a walk through the park, a warm afternoon breeze, a part of him stood guard, scanning the horizon of the future for signs of trouble. And strangely enough, the guarding itself became exhausting. His shoulders felt heavy by the end of days that had technically gone well. Nothing terrible had happened, yet he carried the quiet fatigue of someone who had spent hours lifting invisible weight. Sometimes he wondered, almost with a tired smile, how something that never arrived could still drain so much strength. One evening, while waiting for a train that was running late, he noticed how tightly his hands were clasped together. He loosened them, then laughed softly under his breath. The platform was calm, the sky fading into a soft orange, and yet his mind had already traveled into tomorrow's worries. If someone had asked him why, he might have shrugged and said it was simply being responsible. After all, wasn't worry a kind of protection? Wasn't anticipating problems the safest way to live? That belief had been quietly living inside him for years, almost unquestioned. Still, a small doubt had begun to stir lately. Sometimes, during rare moments of stillness, he noticed that the fears he carried often dissolved on their own. Situations unfolded, conversations happened, days passed, and many of the disasters his mind predicted simply never arrived. It left him wondering something he couldn't quite answer yet. If most of the storms lived only inside the mind, then perhaps the weight he carried wasn't coming from life itself. Perhaps it came from something else entirely, something subtle, something invisible, something he had never thought to question. And as he stood there on the quiet platform, watching the tracks disappear into the distance, Daniel felt the faintest curiosity arise, a soft, almost hesitant thought. What if freedom didn't begin by solving every worry, but by learning not to believe every worried thought? That small question lingered gently in the air, like the first ripple before a deeper discovery. A few days after that quiet evening at the train platform, Daniel began noticing something curious about his thoughts. They didn't arrive with a knock or an introduction. They simply appeared, like uninvited guests slipping through an open door. One moment he was washing dishes, feeling the warmth of the water on his hands, and the next moment his mind whispered, "What if tomorrow goes wrong?" He used to follow those whispers immediately. Almost automatically, he would start building entire stories around them. Possible failures, awkward conversations, imagined criticism. Yet recently, something had shifted just a little. Instead of chasing every thought, he sometimes paused for a second, noticing how quickly those worries formed and how strangely fragile they were. It reminded him of watching clouds drift across the sky during long childhood afternoons. Some clouds looked enormous at first glance, dark and heavy, as if they might bring a storm. But if he simply watched them long enough, they slowly thinned, stretched, and quietly disappeared into the blue without leaving a single drop of rain. His worries, he realized, behaved in much the same way. They arrived loudly, demanding attention, insisting they carried important warnings. Yet when he didn't immediately cling to them, they often faded on their own, like clouds losing their shape in the wind. Still, part of him hesitated to trust this observation. Letting worries pass felt almost irresponsible, like ignoring a smoke alarm that might be real. He had always believed that staying alert, constantly preparing for trouble, was what kept life from falling apart. And yet, there was another truth slowly revealing itself. The more he fed those imagined fears, the heavier his days became. Thoughts multiplied, one attaching itself to the next, until his mind felt crowded with scenarios that hadn't happened and might never happen. It was as if his mind had been writing stories about the future and asking him to live inside them. Stories where everything could go wrong, stories where mistakes were certain, stories where he had to remain tense, just in case. But lately, Daniel had begun to glimpse something else, a quiet space beneath those stories, a moment where he could simply notice a worried thought and whisper to himself, "Ah, there you are again. Not an enemy, not a command, just a passing visitor." And somewhere beyond those passing visitors, he sensed there might be a kind of peace his mind rarely predicted, a calm that didn't depend on solving every imagined problem. He didn't know it yet, but very soon life would show him something that would make this quiet realization impossible to ignore, and it would appear in the most unexpected form. For most of his life, Daniel believed worry was simply part of being careful. He carried it the way someone carries an umbrella on a cloudy day, just in case. If a meeting was scheduled, he imagined everything that could go wrong. If someone spoke to him with a short tone, his mind quietly replayed the moment all evening, searching for hidden meanings. Little by little, this habit shaped the rhythm of his days. When friends laughed around a dinner table, he sometimes drifted away inside his own thoughts, wondering whether he had said something foolish earlier. When a message arrived late at night, his stomach tightened before he even opened it, as if disappointment were already waiting on the other side of the screen. And so, joy often arrived gently, but stayed only briefly. Even peaceful moments seemed to carry a faint shadow of anticipation. While walking through the park one afternoon, Daniel noticed children running freely across the grass, their laughter moving like a breeze through the trees. He watched them for a moment and realized something strange. Their bodies moved lightly, but his mind felt like it was dragging invisible weight behind it. What troubled him most wasn't just the worry itself, it was the belief beneath it. Somewhere deep inside, he felt that if he stopped worrying, he might miss something important. Perhaps worry was the thing keeping him alert, protecting him from embarrassment, mistakes, or unexpected pain. After all, he told himself, people who relax too much sometimes get caught off guard. Better to stay prepared, better to anticipate disappointment before it arrives. That way, if something goes wrong, it won't hurt quite as much. Still, the cost of this constant preparation had quietly begun to show. His shoulders often felt tight by evening. Sleep sometimes came late, as if his mind were still standing watch long after the day had ended. Even on calm days, his thoughts behaved like restless guards pacing a quiet hallway. One afternoon, after a small misunderstanding at work that left him replaying the conversation for hours, Daniel sat alone on a park bench. The breeze moved softly through the leaves above him, and yet his mind continued running through the same scene again and again, adjusting words that had already been spoken. He sighed and leaned back, staring at the sky. It was strange, he thought. The moment had passed hours ago. The other person had likely forgotten about it entirely, yet his mind held on to it as if it were still unfolding right now. In that quiet moment, he became aware of something deeper, not just the thoughts themselves, but the invisible grip they seemed to have on him. And though he couldn't see it yet, there was a certain object, fragile, almost laughably delicate, that would soon reveal exactly what had been holding him captive all along. A few evenings later, Daniel found himself walking slowly through a quiet street market near his apartment. Lanterns swayed gently above the stalls, casting warm pools of light onto wooden tables filled with small handmade objects. The air smelled faintly of roasted nuts and tea leaves, and for a moment, his mind almost rested. One small stall caught his attention. An elderly craftswoman sat behind it, folding delicate strips of paper into thin loops and linking them together. Curious, Daniel stepped closer and watched her hands move with patient rhythm. Before long, she had formed what looked like a chain, light, pale, and almost weightless. Daniel picked up one of the paper chains she had finished. It rested in his palm like a fragile ribbon. He tugged gently, half expecting it to break instantly, yet the loops held together, not because the paper was strong, but because each piece depended on the next. Something about it made him pause. The craftswoman smiled softly. "Funny thing about paper chains," she said. "They look delicate, but when enough links are connected, they can hold someone in place." Her words weren't heavy or mysterious, just spoken with the quiet tone of someone stating an ordinary fact. Daniel chuckled politely, though the image lingered longer than he expected. A chain made of paper. It sounded almost ridiculous. No one would ever believe such a thing could restrain a person. Yet, as he walked home later that evening, the thought followed him like a quiet echo. Because when a worried thought appeared, what if tomorrow goes badly? Another one quickly linked to it. What if you say something wrong? And then another. What if people notice? Link after link. By the time he reached his apartment door, Daniel felt that familiar heaviness again, the subtle tension in his shoulders. He set his keys down on the table and laughed softly at himself. Paper chains, he thought. That would be absurd. Still, the strange image stayed with him. His mind seemed to be doing exactly that, linking one fragile thought to another, until the chain felt strong enough to pull his attention wherever it pleased. And somewhere in the quiet corners of his awareness, a gentle question began forming, one that he wasn't quite ready to answer yet. If those chains were truly made of something so fragile, then why did they feel so difficult to break? A few days later, Daniel returned to the small market street almost without thinking. The lanterns were glowing again, soft and steady, and the same gentle evening breeze moved between the stalls. Part of him wondered whether he would see the woman with the paper chains again, though he wasn't entirely sure why the thought felt important. This time, however, it wasn't the craft stall that caught his attention. A little further down the street, an older man sat on a wooden bench beside a tea stand. He was stirring a small cup slowly, watching the steam rise as if it were the most interesting thing in the world. There was something unusual about the way he sat. Not dramatic, not particularly impressive, just light. His shoulders rested easily, his breathing seemed unhurried, and his eyes wandered calmly across the evening scene without searching for anything in particular. Daniel ordered tea and sat nearby. For a few minutes, neither of them spoke. The quiet between them wasn't awkward, though. It felt more like a shared pause in a long conversation life had been rushing through. Eventually, the older man glanced toward him with a friendly smile. "Your forehead has been working very hard tonight," he said gently, nodding toward Daniel's furrowed brow. Daniel blinked and laughed under his breath. "I didn't realize it was so obvious." "Oh, it usually is," the man replied, lifting his cup. "Worry tends to leave small footprints on the face." Daniel hesitated, then spoke honestly. "I suppose I've always thought worrying was useful, like preparing for things." The man nodded thoughtfully. "Ah, preparing for storms that may arrive." Daniel tilted his head slightly. "Isn't that sensible?" The man took another slow sip of tea. "Sometimes, but tell me, if a person spends every clear day bracing for rain, do they ever notice the sunlight?" Daniel didn't answer right away. The man continued, still calm. "Many people think worry protects them, but often it's just a habit, a chain of small thoughts linked together, strong enough to pull the mind, yet fragile enough to fall apart if someone simply looks at it carefully." Daniel felt a faint chill of recognition at those words. Paper chains. The man noticed the shift in his expression and smiled softly. So you've seen them already." Daniel looked up, surprised, and for the first time he had the strange sense that someone else could see the invisible links he had been carrying for years. Daniel returned to the bench the following evening, almost as if something inside him had been gently pulled back there. The same lantern light glowed across the street, and the old man was sitting in nearly the same place, warming his hands around a cup of tea. When he saw Daniel approaching, he smiled in that quiet, knowing way that made everything feel strangely unhurried. "Ah," the man said softly. "The traveler of paper chains has returned." Daniel sat beside him with a small laugh. "I've been thinking about what you said." He rubbed the back of his neck. "About worry being a habit." The man nodded, not correcting him, not rushing to explain. Instead, he reached into the small cloth bag beside him and pulled out something delicate, a short chain made of thin paper loops, much like the ones Daniel had seen at the market stall. "Tell me," the mentor said, placing the chain gently in Daniel's hands. "Does this look strong?" Daniel examined it and shook his head. "Not at all." "Yet," the man continued calmly, "if someone believed it was made of iron, they might stop trying to move." Daniel felt the words land quietly somewhere inside his chest. The mentor lifted one of the loops and held it between his fingers. Thoughts behave in much the same way. A worried thought appears. What if something goes wrong? Then another arrives. What if you can't handle it? Soon the mind links them together. He gently tugged the chain apart, and one paper loop slipped free. "The secret," he said softly, "is not to fight the chain. Fighting only adds more links. The real freedom begins when you simply see what it's made of." Daniel looked down at the fragile paper in his hand. The mentor continued, almost in a whisper. "When a worried thought arrives, try this. Pause for one breath. Just one. Notice the thought, the way you would notice a bird flying past the window. No chasing it, no arguing with it." He demonstrated slowly, inhaling through his nose and letting the breath leave gently. "Then say quietly inside your mind, a thought, not a command, not a prophecy, just a thought visiting for a moment." Daniel tried it right there on the bench. A familiar worry appeared almost immediately, something about tomorrow's work meeting, but instead of following it, he simply breathed in, then out, letting the thought sit there like a small cloud. To his surprise, it softened slightly. The mentor noticed the shift in Daniel's expression and chuckled warmly. "You see, even paper chains loosen when someone stops believing they're made of steel." Daniel looked again at the small broken loop resting in his palm. For the first time, he wondered whether those invisible chains that had followed him for years might not be as strong as he once believed. And quietly, almost without realizing it, he felt the first link begin to loosen. In the days that followed, Daniel didn't suddenly become fearless. The old thoughts still arrived, sometimes early in the morning, sometimes while standing in line for coffee, sometimes late at night when the room grew quiet. Worry had been visiting him for years. It wasn't about to disappear overnight, but something subtle had changed. Instead of grabbing each thought the moment it appeared, Daniel began doing the small thing the mentor had shown him. Just one breath, in and out. Then quietly, almost like greeting a passerby, he would whisper inside his mind, a thought. At first it felt awkward. A worried voice would say, "What if you embarrass yourself tomorrow?" And his old instinct was still to follow it into a long explanation. Yet now he sometimes paused, noticing how the thought hovered there like a piece of paper drifting in the air. He didn't push it away. He didn't chase it either. One afternoon, while walking home, he imagined those paper chains again, link after link made of fragile thoughts. For years he had been pulling them tightly around himself without realizing it. But now, each pause, each quiet breath, seemed to loosen one small loop. The strange thing was how light those moments felt. At work, when a colleague spoke sharply during a meeting, the familiar wave of self-doubt began rising inside him. But instead of immediately replaying the moment, Daniel took a slow breath beneath the table. A thought, he reminded himself gently. The thought lingered for a moment, then thinned. Later that evening, he sat by the window with a notebook. On one page he wrote a single sentence. "This worry is only a thought passing through." He closed the notebook, smiled a little at the simplicity of it, and felt his shoulders soften. Little by little, the paper chains that once felt so solid began to change. Some links simply fell away when he noticed them clearly. Others loosened slowly, like knots relaxing under patient fingers. Of course, not every moment was easy. Sometimes worries still rushed in like a small crowd. Yet even then, Daniel had begun to see something important. The chains only tightened when he held them too closely. And the more he practiced letting thoughts pass through his awareness, the more often he discovered quiet spaces in between them. Spaces where life felt lighter. Spaces where the mind, for a moment or two, finally rested. And soon, those small spaces would be tested in a situation that once would have tied his paper chains tighter than ever. A week later, Daniel found himself sitting in a meeting that would once have unsettled him for hours. The room felt slightly warm, the table crowded with papers and quiet expectations. Someone across from him began pointing out small problems in a project he had helped prepare. A familiar ripple of worry stirred inside him. In the past, that moment would have triggered an avalanche of thoughts. You should have done this better. They're disappointed. You're about to look foolish. The paper chains would have formed quickly, link after link tightening around his attention. But this time, something softer happened. Daniel felt the first worried thought appear, clear as a small whisper. Instead of wrestling with it, he let his hands rest calmly on the table and took one slow breath, just as the mentor had shown him. A thought. The sentence wasn't dramatic. It was almost quiet enough to be missed. Yet as he allowed the breath to leave his chest slowly, the next thought didn't latch on as tightly. The invisible chain hesitated before forming its next loop. He listened to the feedback again, this time noticing what was actually being said instead of the story his mind wanted to build around it. A few suggestions were useful. A few were simply opinions. None of them carried the catastrophe his mind had predicted. Later that afternoon, while walking outside the office, Daniel realized something surprising. The moment that once would have followed him all evening had already faded. His mind wasn't replaying the conversation the way it used to. It felt a bit like discovering that a door he once believed was locked had quietly been open all along. That evening, he stopped by the same market street again. Lanterns swayed gently above the walkway, and the scent of tea drifted through the air. He noticed the craft stall with the paper chains and smiled softly to himself. For the first time, he could almost see them clearly, not as restraints, not as something powerful, just small loops of paper, fragile and temporary, waiting to fall apart the moment someone stopped holding them together. And as he walked past the stall, he had the curious sense that life was about to offer another quiet lesson, one that would show him how this small freedom could grow, even in the most uncertain moments. One quiet evening, Daniel found himself sitting on the same wooden bench where he had first met the old man. The market had begun to settle for the night. Lanterns glowed softly, and a few distant conversations floated through the warm air like slow-moving currents. The mentor was there again, calmly pouring tea as if time had never rushed through this place at all. When Daniel sat beside him, the old man didn't ask any grand questions. He simply smiled and slid a small cup toward him. "You look lighter," he said gently. Daniel considered the words and nodded. "Not perfect, but lighter." The mentor chuckled softly. "That's usually how freedom begins." For a moment they sat in silence. Then the mentor reached into his cloth bag and placed a small paper chain on the bench between them. Its loops were thin and pale, barely strong enough to hold together if someone pulled too hard. "Let's try something simple," the mentor said. Daniel leaned closer. "When the next worry appears," the old man continued, "don't wrestle with it. Don't argue with it. Just notice it, the way you would notice a leaf drifting across water." He lifted one paper loop and let it dangle gently. "First, take a slow breath in through your nose. Not a big dramatic breath, just enough to remind your body that this moment is safe." Daniel followed along quietly. "Then," the mentor said, "name the visitor. Inside your mind, simply say, 'This is a thought,' not a warning, not a truth, just a thought." The words landed softly, but they carried an unexpected clarity. The mentor continued, "As you breathe out, imagine the paper chain loosening, one small link slipping free. No force needed." Daniel closed his eyes for a moment and tried it. A worry about tomorrow's responsibilities appeared almost immediately, but this time he watched it the way someone might watch a cloud move across a quiet sky. He breathed in, then out, and in that small pause the thought seemed less solid somehow. The mentor smiled warmly. "You see, freedom rarely arrives as a dramatic moment. Most of the time it begins with something very small, a breath, a noticing, a single loose link in a paper chain. Daniel looked down at the fragile loops resting on the bench. For years he had believed those chains were something he had to carry. Now he was beginning to see that sometimes all it took was a quiet moment of awareness for a link to fall away, and soon life itself would reveal just how open the door had always been. A few weeks later, Daniel noticed something that once would have seemed impossible. The familiar worries still visited from time to time, but they no longer felt like guards standing at the gates of his life. Instead, they came and went, more like passing travelers, noticeable, perhaps a little noisy, but no longer in charge of the road. One morning, while walking through the park, he paused beside a small wooden bridge. The water below moved slowly, carrying leaves and tiny twigs along its quiet current. Daniel rested his hands on the railing and watched how each leaf floated for a moment before drifting away without effort. The image felt strangely familiar. For years, his mind had treated every worried thought like a message carved in stone, something to analyze, defend against, prepare for. Yet now he could see that most of those thoughts had been more like those drifting leaves, temporary shapes appearing on the surface of awareness. Not commands, not predictions, just movements passing through the mind. Later that evening, he visited the market again. The lanterns glowed softly above the street, and the small stall with the paper chains was still there. The craftswoman was linking new loops together, her hands working slowly and patiently. Daniel picked up one of the chains and held it lightly between his fingers. For a moment, he simply looked at it. The loops were the same as before, thin, delicate, almost playful in their simplicity, the kind of object a child might make during a quiet afternoon. And yet, not long ago, he had been living as though such fragile links could truly hold him captive. He smiled gently at the realization. Freedom, he understood now, hadn't come from defeating his worries or eliminating uncertainty from life. Life was still unpredictable. Conversations could still go awkwardly. Mistakes could still happen. But peace had begun the moment he stopped living inside every thought his mind produced. The moment he noticed the chains were made of paper. And as he walked home beneath the dim evening lights, the street felt wider somehow, the air lighter around him. Not because the world had changed, but because he was no longer carrying every imagined storm inside his chest. Somewhere behind him, the lanterns swayed softly in the night breeze, and the quiet space within him, open, steady, and unburdened, felt very much like stepping into a doorway that had been there all along.